Good morning, everyone. For those of you who follow the daily reading plan, we would have just recently have completed the book of Ecclesiastes, and you would have to agree with me that it surely is quite a remarkable book. While we all know from Paul in his letter to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16 that all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, truly furnished unto all good works. And if we go and look at this same verse in the ESV, puts it slightly differently, I think slightly more clearer, but the opening part of that verse is quite interesting, and it says there, all scripture is breathed out by God. So we have this concept of God breathing out scripture, and we're going to come back to this particular concept later on. But we have in the various books in the Bible, those that are letters to various people or churches. We have books that deal with prophecies. We have books that are predominantly filled with historical accounts of what transpired to various people, specifically the Jews. And all of these have aspects that Paul mentioned and highlighted in them. But when we look at Ecclesiastes, where does it fit? Because as you start reading its chapters, you could be forgiven for, to be frank, getting a bit depressed. And so what I want to do this morning is just spend a bit of time looking at some background to Ecclesiastes so that we can be better able to appreciate why God gave us this book and how it can play a major role in providing us with doctrine, correction, instruction in righteousness, and so lead us to be more complete before God, equipped for every good work. But before we start, we need to look at who most likely wrote Ecclesiastes, because it doesn't specifically state who the author is. But establishing who wrote it goes a long way towards enabling us to not only know why God gave it to us, but the context and our understanding of it is greatly enhanced. So who wrote the book? The title Ecclesiastes comes from a Greek word indicating a person who calls an assembly. So it makes sense that the author identifies himself in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 1 by the Hebrew word koheleth, and that has been translated for us as preacher. And despite leaving only this rather mysterious name to indicate his identity, evidence in the book, along with most Jewish and Christian traditions, suggests that King Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. The preacher, or this koheleth as he calls himself, titles himself the son of David, king in Jerusalem, and one who has acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And then in chapter 12 and verse 9, he brings out this point that he is one who has collected many proverbs. And Solomon, we know, followed David on the throne in Jerusalem, and he was the only Davidic son to rule over all Israel from that city. And we find this in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 12. We also know that he was the wisest man in the world during his time, and we can find this in 1 Kings chapter 4 and verses 29 to 30. And we also know from Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 1 that he wrote most of the book of Proverbs. And I think from this alone we can safely identify Solomon as the koheleth of the opening verse in Ecclesiastes. But when we marry what we read as the experiences the writer goes through in Ecclesiastes and marry that with the life of what we know about Solomon as we read Kings and Chronicles, I think we are led to the only conclusion, and that is that only a man of Solomon's wisdom, wealth, and position could put himself through the experiences we read about in Ecclesiastes and come to the conclusions that he did. In fact, it appears that one of the very reasons God gave Solomon all of this was to provide us with Ecclesiastes. So let's look at what happened to Solomon so that we have a full background on which to build our understanding of this remarkable book. And so the first verse we're going to go to from 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 3, we read there that Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. And if we think about that statement, to have that said of one in Scripture is high praise indeed. That we are titled, or Solomon is in this particular case, as walking in the statutes of David his father. 2 verses later, we find that God says to Solomon in verse 5, ask what I shall give you. So as a result of what transpired in verse 3 in that commentary, God asked Solomon, whatever you want from me, I will give you. And notice here that God placed no restriction on what he could ask for or what he could have. And picture yourself or any human being finding themselves in this position, standing before the creator of the entire universe and being said that you could ask for anything. What would you or what would they ask for? And notice here that this is not just one wish, so to speak. If we compare it to the famous lamp that you rub and a genie pops out and the genie always gives you 3 wishes. God wasn't offering Solomon a limited number of wishes. It was an open-ended invitation. Ask what I shall give you. Solomon could have asked anything, any number of things. There was no limit on what he could have and how much he could have. So what does Solomon actually ask for? Well, we read in verse 9 of chapter 3, Solomon says to God, give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. Unlimited. And yet he asks for the wisdom and the understanding to be able to look after his people. A truly remarkable request. And God recognizes this. God replies in verse 10, it pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And so God grants the request and adds additional unasked for things. And so we find a record of this in verses 11 to 14. And God said to Solomon, because you have asked this and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. Behold, now I do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. And that could have been the end of it, because that's really all Solomon asked for. But God continues, I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. But when we read the record of Solomon's life in Kings and Chronicles, what do we find? Well, in chapter 10 and verse 23, we read, thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. So that's exactly as God had promised him, that he would be richer than anybody else on the planet, that he would be wiser than anybody else on the planet. And 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 23 confirms that this is the case. And so, in reading that, that's all great at this point. But then we read the account in 1 Kings chapter 11. And notice the title of this chapter. It's titled, Solomon Turns from the Lord. And it is a sad account, a whole chapter devoted to this most blessed of men, granted everything somebody could ever want. And he turns his back on following God with all his heart and being led astray to go and worship other gods. And if we read 1 Kings chapter 11 in isolation, and by that I mean we only read about Solomon in Kings and Chronicles, we come to the conclusion that Solomon remains astray from God until his grave. Because we have this whole account in chapter 11, itemizing and detailing the manner in which Solomon turned his back on God and where he went astray. And the chapter then closes and concludes with these words in verses 41 to 43. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the books of the acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. Now I've heard people debating as to whether Solomon will be in the kingdom or not, but based on our reading of 1 Kings chapter 11, there is absolutely no reason to think that he does have some last-minute change of heart and turns back to God. There's nothing sandwiched before that verse 41 to indicate that Solomon has changed tact and turned back to God. And if that is the conclusion of the matter, that God grants a man all the wisdom, all the wealth, all the status he could ever ask for, and this is where it ends up, then this truly is highly distressing. And so on that depressing note, let's take a break, and we're going to return shortly, where we will look at the second part of this talk, the actual conclusion of the matter, and what God is wanting to teach us. We ended off with a rather depressing note, with all indications that despite all the blessings God had poured out on Solomon, he lost his way and turned his back not only on God, but on a life of eternity in the kingdom. But as we pointed out, all evidence suggests that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, and further to that if we read Ecclesiastes as the final words and conclusion Solomon arrives at the end of his life, the impact of what he writes has so much more relevance, providing warning and instruction for each of us, exactly what Paul was impressing on Timothy. So as we read the book of Ecclesiastes, the content reflects somebody looking back on a life that was long on experience, but short on lasting rewards. As king, Solomon has all the opportunity and resources to pursue the rewards of wisdom, of pleasure, and of work in and of themselves. There was nothing he couldn't have or do or try, and he used his great wealth and knowledge to explore everything a person could ever dream of or desire to do. Yet as we read the account, we get pouring through the words this world-weary tone that suggests that late in life, he looked back on all of his endeavors and folly with regret. And he points us to a better, simpler life lived in the light of God's direction. So why is Ecclesiastes so important? Well, it describes to us a naturalistic vision of life, one that sees life through distinctly human eyes, but ultimately recognizes the rule and reign of God in the world. This more humanistic quality can make the book especially popular to men and women who have seen more than their fair share of pain and instability in life, but who still cling to their hope in God. Now, there are a variety of themes that we can look at, and I'm going to touch on some of the main ones, but there are many, many more, and each one, quite frankly, is a study in its own. So there's 7 of them we're going to look at, and the first one is a strong theme that comes out, and it's to do with time. And this seemingly repetitive, cyclical progression that we go through in life of time, the way we experience life as we live under the sun, as mortal human beings living under the sun, we go through this cycle and progression of time. And when we stand back and look at it, it just seems, as Solomon puts it, vain and meaningless. We are no different from animals. We are born, we grow older, we learn, we love, we hate, we experience pain and suffering, we watch loved ones grow older or die from disease, and we ultimately ourselves grow older, and ultimately we know the end of it is death and the grave. So we have this cyclical nature of birth to death, and everybody experiences it. And so when we look at it, it's as if, what's the point? What's the point of just going through the cyclical nature with all it's going to lead to is death? It just seems meaningless. And Solomon goes on to, in a way, poetically, I guess you could call it, describe the almost unfathomable mystery of God's hand of providence in time, the way God is able to integrate himself into the time and the life we live in and play a particular role. Solomon acknowledges that God, as the supreme creator, has the supremacy assigned to him because he is, after all, the creator of the universe. And somehow, in all that he's done, he has been able to make everything appear beautiful. Solomon goes on to say that because we as human beings have been made in the image of God, our hearts long to escape time and to experience eternity or immortality. So built within us by God is this feeling that we have, that we want to live beyond this cyclical time period that we have been given. And so we want to experience or clutch for eternity or immortality. But nevertheless, Solomon says, just because we have this vain desire to live forever, it mustn't prevent us in the life that we have from enjoying our time on earth, because it has been appointed to us by God to live this life from birth to death. The next theme we look at is to do with work, and here Solomon brings out the value and the reward of laboring under the sun, because this task has been set down and established for us by God. It's what he has appointed us to do. And we pick this up right back in the book of Genesis, where Adam was told by God that he would work by the sweat of his brow. So when we look at this and take it into our context, we have in the modern age this idea of retirement. We retire when we're 65 and we cease to work. And we in a sense say it's our right now to put our feet up. But when we take this and apply it to our particular church or place of worship, God hasn't, in the pages of Scripture, brought out anything of this idea of retirement. And yet we hear this coming through where older members of a particular church or meeting say it's time to put their feet up. Then in a sense they're retiring and they're going to hand over the reins to the younger generation. And while that's good to pass that on, I don't think there's a place in Scripture that allows us to take this viewpoint that we can just retire from our work and obligations within our meeting or church. Solomon goes on to point out that for those of us who apply ourselves hard and honestly in our labor, then obviously as a result of that labor, as a result of those endeavors, we will enjoy the benefits and rewards in this life. And those will come in terms of food, drink, sleep, and other pleasures that you may be able to afford with what you have created from your labor. In our day, it's generally money, but in the past, it might have been crops, fruit, animals, etc. And sometimes, as Solomon points out, for reasons that aren't revealed, God deprives man from enjoying the ordinary fruit of his labor. So as much as we are told by Solomon that if we work in honest labor, we will have these fruits of our labor, sometimes God takes them away from us. And something happens to us and we don't get the opportunity to enjoy those. And it could be just a lost job through no fault of our own. It could be a storm that comes through and wrecks our crops, kills our animals. There's a whole host of things that could happen to us that deprive us of the rewards of our labor. Obviously, one of the things is sinful motives and the inherent selfishness of man, because these aspects will certainly spoil the rewards that God offers to us for the labor that we give. And so greedy men, sinful men, may come along and steal, rob, take, abuse what we have done. And this is a reality of life. But nevertheless, Solomon says, work in this life is our current obligation. And we should work diligently at whatever we're doing until we die. And this applies both in the real workplace where we work for a reward, for money, for wages, for a salary, but also within our church or our meeting. We need to keep working to whatever ability we are able to until we die. There is no such thing as retirement. Our third theme is to do with friends. And what Solomon brings out here is that if we isolate ourselves, if we personally choose to isolate ourselves, not only is this concept vanity, but it is a symptom of sinful selfishness. To remove yourself from mingling and mixing with other people is vain and selfish. And it's something to sit back and think about, because even within our church or worship place, if we isolate ourselves, if we don't come to that church or meeting to worship and mingle with people who share the same faith that we do, by isolating ourselves, it is a symptom, Solomon says, of sinful selfishness. Why? Because we not only are depriving ourselves of the benefit of mingling with people who are able to provide us with so much support in our walk to God's kingdom, but we also deprive them of our input, our help, our encouragement in their walk. Now, cooperating with friends, Solomon points out quite strongly, makes our labor under the sun, makes our experiences in this life that much more easy and that much more productive. And it's that old adage that two hands make light work. By working together with somebody or others, the sum of the parts is always greater than the individual parts. Now, having good friends, as we know, provides safety, it provides support, it provides strength, it provides encouragement on the way. So when life gets tough, when things are hard, when we really need support, that's what friends will do. And likewise within your church or your worship community, those people that you meet and fellowship with are there to provide these very things, to provide that support and that encouragement. When you're feeling down, when you're weighed down by your sin or the things that are happening in your life, those people you worship with will be able to provide that strength and support. Now, choosing good friends is difficult because it requires a great deal of careful insight. But bear in mind that we don't walk out into life and spot someone down the road and say, you're going to be my friend. Friendship is something that develops with time. But what Solomon is saying is that when we decide to be friends with somebody, as we see some form of affinity with them, we need to be careful to analyze them and see whether their motives and their goals are in line with ours. Otherwise, we're likely to be pulled in the wrong direction. Now, within your place of worship, you can't necessarily choose who the people are that you're going to worship with. But you do need to make that effort to find common areas and work together. And the best way to find and keep friends, Solomon says, is to show yourself to be a friendly and reliable person. If you are friendly and reliable, people will want to be your friend because they know that you will be giving them that support and that strength and that comfort when they need it, because that's the type of person you are. Our fourth theme is to do with worship. And Solomon brings out this point that not all acts of worship are acceptable in the eyes of God. And so we need to be quite careful in the way we approach our worship to God and think very carefully, are the things that we are doing for our benefit, or are they going to be acceptable in God's eyes? And we can only see the results we where Jesus on the day of judgment separates the sheep from the goats. And when he separates the goats, they turn to Jesus and say, Lord, Lord, we did this and this and this in your name. And Jesus says, I never knew you. They weren't lying to Jesus. They thought that the things that they did were acceptable acts of worship in the eyes of God. And yet Jesus turns around and says, I never knew you. Those acts that you thought were acceptable were unacceptable to God. And so we need to be very careful to analyze our methods and how we go about worshiping God. We should also always watch our step when we walk into God's presence. When we gather together, we're told that where 2 or 3 meet together, God is in our presence. And so when we meet together in forms of worship, we are in the presence of God, and we need to be very careful to watch our step, because He is holy and we are not. So we need to be careful what we do. We should also be careful, Solomon says, to hold our tongue when attending religious meetings or gatherings, so that we are better able to receive God's word. And what does he mean by this? If we are prone to rattle off and talk a lot, if our nature is to speak a lot and not listen, then how are we going to receive God's word? Because we receive that by listening to other people. So sometimes when we have a gathering and everybody has a bit of input, we need to be quite careful to not hog the floor, to be able to zip our lips, so to speak, and listen carefully to others, because they have great words of wisdom to give to us. And we need to be able to listen carefully and hold our tongue. Now, while we don't, as we know from the New Testament, openly take vows or oaths, we do commit to particular endeavors. For example, committing to performing certain duties or being involved in special efforts or community work within our churches or religious gatherings. These duties can take any form within that meeting, from presiding over a meeting to giving talks to just helping at the door to preparing tea to providing flowers. All of these are commitments and duties that maybe we've been assigned at the beginning of the year in some form of program. And we need to be careful that in accepting these duties, they are in a sense a kind of vow and oath, so to speak. We are committing to do these endeavors. And so these commitments can be viewed in this light and are a part of our religious worship, and we need to take them very seriously. Because in a sense we have vowed or committed to do those before God. And so we have an obligation to perform them and not take them lightly. Solomon also brings out that our words flow from our heart and will ultimately justify or condemn us. And Jesus brings this up in Matthew chapter 12. Out of your mouth comes evil thoughts, etc. And so it's what comes out of us really gives a strong indication of who we are as people. Our fifth theme is to do with injustice. And this again can be a bit depressing when we look at it as a theme. But we all know that we should have an attitude of respectful submission to the powers or the governments of the countries in which we find ourselves. And Solomon brings this aspect out quite strongly, and we pick it up also in the New Testament. And so rather than resorting to acts of rebellion, rebelling against decisions that the government makes that we are unhappy with, we need to be patient, waiting for God to bring His coming judgment upon this world. It requires patience, it requires faith, it requires trust in God. And at the same time, Solomon says we must expect men to rule over others wickedly. We must expect this. God has said Himself that He has put the basest of men in power. And so even when we see these men, whether they be in positions of power in governments or large corporations or companies, and we see them appearing to prosper and go unpunished as a result, we need to realize that this is to be expected. The very fact that there is so much injustice might perhaps leave us, I'm sure, very perplexed, and we may in this life never fully comprehend or understand or resolve why this is the particular case. Why is there so much injustice? Why do bad people seem to get away with things? But Solomon goes on that rather than worrying about all of this, concerning ourselves with this, stressing about it, we should simply leave it with God and enjoy the lives God has given us here and now. Our sixth theme is to do with aging. Solomon brings out this point that God has blessed the days of our youth and calls us to enjoy them as a good gift from his hand. And if you think about that, it's only when you reach old age that you begin to realize how fortunate you were when you were younger, when your body was strong and you were able to run and play sport and do things with your body without aches and pains, and your recovery if you got hurt was so much quicker. But as you get older, the aches and pains come and never leave. And so we need to enjoy and relish our time when we are younger and have bodies like that, because God has blessed those days, and that time will come when he takes that away and we age. God encourages us to enjoy this by inviting us to explore this aging process that we go through as human beings in what I guess could be seen as a rather painful, poetic manner. And he does this in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And so whether young or old, the words of our good shepherd, as we see in Ecclesiastes 12, bring to us vital instruction and advice. And whether young or old, our duty, our calling, it remains exactly the same. Because it is appointed unto man once to die. And after that comes the judgment. We have one life under the sun. And then we die. And then our final theme that I want to look at is this one to do with vanity, and it's an extremely strong theme that we find playing itself out through the pages of Ecclesiastes. And we pick up in the opening words of chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, this Koheleth. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And the Hebrew word here behind this word vanity is this Hebrew word hebel. And it's been translated as vanity 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is a huge quantity for what's really a fairly small book consisting only of 12 chapters. And it literally means breath or vapor. And you can see where I came up with the title for this talk. And we also come across this other phrase to do with under the sun. And this phrase also occurs quite a number of times. It occurs 29 times throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. And really the concept behind this theme of under the sun is just really explaining the perspective from which everything appears as vain. So as human beings, if we just view this from a human perspective, taking God out of the equation, then that is the viewpoint of someone under the sun. Just living in this cycle, we spoke about that theme of time. We live and we age and ultimately die. That is our life under the sun, and we get one shot at it. And so from that perspective, as a human perspective, just here on this planet, to live and die like an animal, everything appears as vain. And the preacher, the Koheleth, the Solomon, establishes and illustrates the absolute feeling of vanity of life through the inevitability of death. Because we know we are going to die, we know we are mortal. We just have this absolute feeling of meaningless and vanity in our life, because there doesn't appear to be anything more than just this cycle of time. And Solomon explores man's vain quest to try to find satisfaction through earthly pleasures and projects and possessions and constructions and things. So Solomon goes and explores all of these things that a human being can do, whatever that project might be, and looks for satisfaction to be gained from those things. And then we find in chapter 2 and verse 11, Solomon says, "Nevertheless, man will never be able to escape the futility of life as seen and experienced while under the sun." So if that is the life we live, if we choose to live a life without God, effectively as an atheist, then we are living under the sun. And we cannot escape the futility of that life that we live under the sun. So we now come to the conclusion or the end of the matter. And when we see this theme of vanity and focus on the meaning behind that Hebrew word hebel, this vapor or breath, we come across a really interesting choice that God is alluding to. Because in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7 we read, "Then the Lord God formed the man of the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living creature." And so we come across here in verse 7 of chapter 2 in Genesis, the method that God went about in creating life. He took dust. We are made from the atoms of the dust of the ground. We only have to think of when they burn bodies, what are they left with? It's just ash, which is really just another form of dust. So we are just dust and water. And God forms us out of the dust of the ground and breathes into us this breath of life, and we become living creatures. And from that point on, we are alive as long as we continue to breathe. Even when unconscious and sleep, we continue to breathe. And as has been pointed out before, with every breath we take in and out, we are breathing God's name. When you pronounce God's name, His name is a breath in and a breath out. Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh. And so we breathe continually, and we say repeatedly, with every breath we take, God's name. And we do so until we breathe our last. And I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but you actually can't stop yourself from breathing. You can hold your breath, and maybe you could even get to a point where you might pass out from lack of breathing. But the moment you lose conscious, your body will kick in naturally, and you will start breathing again. You cannot kill yourself by holding your breath. You have to take some external means, a rope or something like that, to strangle yourself in order to be able to kill yourself by not breathing. But you physically can't do it with your mind. And it's quite an interesting concept about that. And we think about a baby when it's born. The moment it comes out, the very first thing it does is to take in a breath and breathe out, often followed by a yell. And so it starts off its very life with God's name, breathing in that first bit, the Yah, and then Veh, breathing out. And so that baby will continue until it dies. And when it dies, it ends off with its last breath, the Veh, as it gives up its last breath. And what is God doing with all of this repeating of His name? He is reminding us that with the very act of breathing, we are acknowledging who gave us this life and who can and will one day take it away. Now, if we pair Genesis chapter 2, verse 7 with Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 7 to 8, what do we notice? Because we see in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 7, "And the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit, the ruach, returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity." So we are seeing here the exact reversal of what we saw in Genesis chapter 2 verse 7. There God breathed into something that had been formed from the dust, and we became a living creature. In Ecclesiastes we find the reversal. That breath goes back to God, the life ceases, and we revert back to dust of the earth. And so what we have in Genesis chapter 2 is life. It's talking about life, God giving life. And what we have in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 is death, the exact opposite, God taking away that life. So we have life and death in these two chapters. And what we notice here is that this Hebel, this vanity, this Hebel is the actual cause of death. This breath is the breath of death. As Solomon terms it, this vanity, this breath is to be likened to striving or chasing after wind. And I don't know if you've ever tried to chase the wind and maybe try and catch it. You can't. It is a totally fruitless exercise. You can't even see the wind. You can feel its effects. You can feel it blowing on you, so you know it's real, but you can't see it. And you can, for a time, maybe try and capture some of its energy. For example, in the sail of a yacht on a lake or on the ocean, or maybe with a wind turbine to turn that wind energy into electricity. But you can never really catch it, can you? When at the end of the day you've finished all of your sailing on the lake or on the sea, and you bring down the sail, how much wind have you caught in that sail? It's empty. You've caught nothing. You've just extracted the energy. You have not actually caught the wind. So you can never really catch wind. And especially a wind, if you think about it, that is blowing away from you, one that requires you to chase after it. It's not even as if it's blowing into you, into your sail. This is one blowing away from you. And so chasing after the wind is an absolute waste of time, a totally meaningless and futile exercise. And it's a beautiful analogy to describe the meaningless of life, this chasing after wind. But God's breath is different from this Hebel. God's breath is the breath of life. And you'll recall in the opening verse we looked at from 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16 that all scripture is breathed out by God, as we saw in the ESV. And the Greek word here is theopneustos, and it means God breathed or divine breath. And we probably maybe think back to Job's words of Job chapter 33 and verse 4, where Job said, "The breath of the Almighty gives me life." So he reaffirms this concept of God breathing into us and giving us life. God's breath is the breath of life. And that spirit, that ruach that God gives us, is the only real source of life, and it only comes from God. There's no other source for the source of life. The ruach comes only from God. And we can either use it while we have it in service to God, or we can waste it, and it will return to Him forever. And so much like Moses' words to the children of Israel as they were about to enter the promised land, you might recall what he said to them. In Genesis chapter 30 and verse 19, "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live." And so we have before us today a choice. We can choose the breath of life from God, this ruach, or we can choose the breath of death, the Hebel, the vanity of this world. And so in Ecclesiastes we find God giving Solomon every single thing a human being could ever desire or want. Unlimited wisdom, unlimited wealth, unlimited status. And with unfettered restraint, God lets him loose to see if he could find happiness, whether he could find satisfaction, whether he could find meaning to life with what he had been given. And having tried it all, everything, and we can read the account of this, Solomon at the end of his life came to the conclusion, on our behalf and for our instruction, that there is no joy, that there is no satisfaction, that there is no meaning to life outside of the one who created us. And if you think about it, that is logical. God created us with the express purpose of having an intimate relationship with Him and endeavoring to learn from that relationship to be like Him. And if we choose to not do that, how can there ever be any meaning to this life? It's just vapor, the breath of death. I use an example of breeding and training and feeding a supreme racehorse and then making it plow a field. It's meaningless. That horse is never going to be satisfied plowing a field when it was trained to be this sprinter in a race. And so we have been designed and made for a specific purpose, and we will never find satisfaction in life if we do not adhere to that purpose. And the proof of this is all around us. Never has the world been able to live a life as closely as the one that Solomon did, with all of our conveniences, our luxuries, our lavish lifestyles. But likewise, never has mankind been more estranged from God. And the result, never has the world been more full of unhappy and lost people, people with no hope and no meaning in their life. And so Solomon concludes, after all his endeavors at self-satisfaction, with the following words: "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter." So after experiencing all of this life, all of these endeavors to find self-satisfaction in the things of this world, in this life, he says, here is the conclusion of the whole matter. This is what I've learned, having gone through all of this experience. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. The final conclusion, after a life full of experimentation, of excess, of self-satisfaction, of pandering to every whim that a man could lust after, and he comes to the conclusion that the only source of enduring satisfaction beyond all doubt, that if we want a joyful life with real fulfillment and contentment, then we have to cooperate with God. We have to understand his purpose in creating us, that we might develop in his moral image and likeness to ultimately one day reflect his glory. And we do so by making God the object of our life, by fearing him and keeping his commandments. Which commandments? Asked the lawyer of Jesus. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Notice not some of the law and the prophets, all of the law and the prophets, the whole Old Testament, really hinged on these two commandments. And so as we come now to remember Jesus and the bread and the wine, we remember the only man who ever managed to fully fear God and keep his commandments. Amen.